The African delegates were now on their feet, shouting accusations. Security moved to restore order, but Ibrahim raised his hand, and the International Monetary Fund headquarters in Washington, D.C. had never hosted a meeting quite like this. On March 18, 2025, representatives from 42 African nations sat across from IMF officials, but unlike every previous meeting in the institution's 80-year history, the Africans weren't there to beg for loans, they were there to collect what was theirs. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva had called the emergency meeting after discovering that African nations collectively owed the IMF $280 billion, but had refused to make their quarterly payments. What she didn't know was that Ibrahim Traore had spent 2 years preparing for this exact moment, gathering evidence that would not just cancel African debt, but destroy the IMF's entire operational model. The trap had been set 6 months earlier when the IMF, desperate to maintain control over African economies, had proposed what they called the Gold Collateral Initiative. The terms seemed generous on the surface. African nations could use their gold reserves as collateral for new development loans at favorable rates. What the fine print revealed, however, was that any missed payment would result in automatic forfeiture of the gold to IMF vaults. Ibrahim had read the proposal and smiled. It was exactly what he had predicted they would do. The meeting began with Georgieva's practice speech about mutual cooperation and sustainable development. She wore a designer suit that cost more than most Africans earned in a year, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing as she explained why Africa needed the IMF's guidance. The Gold Collateral Initiative represents a new chapter in Africa-IMF relations, she said, her tone patronizing. By securing loans with your gold reserves, you'll access capital for development while we ensure fiscal responsibility. Ibrahim sat quietly in the front row, flanked by finance ministers from Nigeria, South Africa, Ghana, and Kenya. They waited for her to finish her presentation, which included colorful charts showing how Africa would prosper under IMF management. When she finished, Ibrahim stood slowly. At 6'2" he towered over the diminutive Georgieva, but it wasn't his height that commanded the room, it was the folder he placed on the table. "Madame Director," he began, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made several IMF officials shift nervously. "Before we discuss your proposal, I have a question. How much gold does the IMF currently hold?" Georgieva seemed puzzled by the question. "Approximately 2,814 metric tons, worth roughly $180 billion at current prices." "And where did this gold come from?" Ibrahim asked. "Member nations' contributions, of course. It's all properly documented." "Is it?" Ibrahim interrupted, opening his folder. "Because I have different documentation." He pulled out a document and projected it on the meeting room screen. It was an internal IMF memo from 1971, marked strictly confidential, destroy after reading. Someone had clearly not followed instructions. The memo detailed Operation Golden Leash, a systematic plan to trap developing nations, particularly African countries, into debt cycles that would force them to surrender their gold reserves. The language was explicit. By structuring loans with impossible repayment terms hidden in complex financial language, we can ensure default and legal seizure of collateral gold. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Several African delegates stood up in anger. Georgieva's face went pale. This must be fake," she stammered.
"Fake?" Ibrahim pulled out more documents.
"Here's the 1976 implementation report, 1982 progress review,
1994 expansion proposal, 2008 modernization plan.
and my favorite, the 2019 briefing where you personally, Madam Director, approved Phase 7, the final harvest." The document clearly showed Georgieva's signature on a plan to seize all African gold reserves by 2030 through manufactured debt crises. But Ibrahim was just getting started. Let's discuss specific cases. Ghana, 1983. The IMF provided a $1 billion loan with a floating interest rate tied to a basket of currencies you knew would spike. When Ghana couldn't pay, you took 45 tons of gold. The loan was worth $1 billion. The gold is now worth $3 billion. He continued methodically. Nigeria, 1991. Senegal, 1998.
Zimbabwe, 2003.
Each time the pattern is identical. Impossible loan terms, manufactured default, gold seizure. Over 50 years the IMF has stolen approximately 1,200 tons of African gold through this scheme. The African delegates were now on their feet.